It's going to be a very fascinating offseason for the San Francisco Giants. Yet again, they have a lot of money coming off the books. They have almost $100 million they could theoretically spend just to get to the level they were at this year. And Farhan Zaidi recently talked about how they need to establish more position players, everyday position players, going forward. So who are some of the guys they could target in free agency to be everyday players? We'll talk about it next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts, including YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And where we start, like I said, is just I've been thinking about the offseason, given that the Giants are still technically alive in 2022, but playoff odds are between 0 and 5%. They're low. And we had these comments by Farhan Zaidi earlier this week that he said it was important for the Giants to establish 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 everyday players, position players. And he also acknowledged that their farm system isn't necessarily going to churn that out next year, which is like, okay, so how are you going to do it? Because they don't currently have anybody except maybe Brandon Crawford for next year when we look at who is set to come back. So as I mentioned, they have a lot of money coming off the books. So their 2022 payroll, counting some things like buyouts, the buyout they paid to Johnny Cueto, that gets factored in on Fangraphs for their payroll. But this year and last year, it was about $162 million or thereabouts. And going into next year, with Carlos Rodon, it's at $89 million. If you subtract Carlos Rodon, like if he opts out, suddenly you're at $66.5 million. So that gives you literally about $100 million to spend on 2023 payroll. This is not like, okay, you can give one guy a $100 million deal and call it a day. If you give a guy a $100 million deal, it's likely broken up like $20 million a year. So we're only talking about the $20 million of that. And then you can make that 100. So you can do that 5 times, if you want, just to get back to this level they've been at for a few years. So anyway, they've got some money to spend, and there are some free agents out there. So I'm just going to go through some of the guys that I've circled as position player targets. And the first guy is the best guy. We're going to look at outfielders first, and the best outfielder, obviously, who's going to be a free agent is Aaron Judge, who is having a monster season. He's probably almost certainly going to win American League MVP this year. He's hitting 296, 394 on base, 659 slugging. At the time of this recording, he has 48 home runs. He has 14 steals. He's only been caught once. He's a good defensive player despite his enormous size, and he's going to be a free agent, and he's from the Bay Area. And so what you would be getting with Aaron Judge is just an elite offensive performer. He has dealt with some injuries over the course of his career, and I have some concerns about that, given that he's not going to be getting younger. He's going to command a deal likely at least 6 years and maybe 7, maybe 8. I think 7 is probably ultimately where he'll land. But given he's dealt with some injuries in the past, and then you're really getting 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, all the way up to age 37 seasons, that's my one concern. But I don't know if I mentioned this yet today, but he's from the Bay Area and grew up a big Giants fan. So you actually have an inroad to luring a player like this to your team. And so he's like number one on my target list. I do just have some questions about the age and the durability, especially as he gets older, but he's clearly the best possible player in general, I would say, Trea Turner makes an argument as well, but certainly best outfielder available and may want to come to the Giants. So the next best outfielder I have, without getting too detail oriented here, I just kind of skimmed through and made this list, and it's plenty of names. But the next guy for me is Brandon Nimmo in terms of outfielders. So Nimmo is 29 years old. He currently plays for the New York Mets. He's a left-handed hitter, right-handed thrower, and kind of the strength of Brandon Nimmo over the course of his career has been that he's been a big on-base percentage guy. He has a career OBP of 384, which is just very, very solid. He also he doesn't strike out a ton, and so his career line is a 266 batting average, a 384 on base, and 437 slugging. So it's not a ton of power. It's kind of like average power, but he gets on base a lot thanks to a career walk rate of 13.6%. So he kind of fits the mold of what the Giants like. He also makes a lot of contact. But he's not a platoon player, kind of importantly, very importantly, because the whole point of this exercise is these are everyday players. These are not platoon players. And so for Nimmo, he's put together 3.7 Fangraphs wins above replacement this season in 117 games, so that's very good. An average player puts together about 2 WAR over the course of a full season. So he's at 3.7 with over a month to go. Judge, by the way, is at 7.9 with the projections that he'll pick up close to another 2. So almost a 10 WAR season, which has very seldomly been done in the history of the game. It happens from time to time, but it's the best seasons of all time. The most recent Giant to put that up was Buster Posey in 2012, a 10 when he won the MVP, a 10 F WAR, Fangraphs WAR season. So I like Nimmo. Judge is obviously better. Nimmo is a year younger, and it would require a deal like a quarter or a third of the total commitment, I would imagine. So then the last outfielder I want to talk about is Mitch Haniger, also a local guy from the Bay Area. I don't know if he grew up a Giants fan, but I do know he's from this area. And he's just kind of quietly been an underrated, really good offensive player in his career. A 124 weighted runs created plus, meaning about 24% percentage points above league average offensively in his career. This year at 139, so even better than that. Last year he hit 39 home runs. As I look at this, he was injured a lot of this year. So this year it is a much smaller sample. So I look to the overall picture as more relevant. He's not necessarily been a great defender. So I would have some interest here, but I'd much rather have Nimmo or Judge, particularly given that Haniger is going to be 32 years old in December. So I wouldn't want to give him a long-term deal. And there's some questions. He's had some durability, fluke, freak injuries he's dealt with. But I think that there's a lot of potential with Mitch Haniger. Pretty patient player. Doesn't walk a ton, but he also doesn't chase a ton. So I like the player, but I have the most questions with him of the three. So coming up in just a minute, we're going to turn our attention to the infielders. And my goodness, there are some good ones. Trea Turner, Nolan Arenado, who we were not thinking about as a guy who would opt out. But he's having such a good season that he's probably going to opt out. And he may be available. And is he the guy for the Giants to target? We'll get into it momentarily, but first, betonline.net. It's the fastest and the easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, as promised, we're going to get into the infielders on this list, starting with Trea Turner, who is 29 years old. He just turned 29 on June 30th. One of the most underrated players in the game, I would say. And case in point, there was a recent Giants-Dodgers game and they were talking about the stars on LA, and they were saying Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman. But Trea Turner may actually be the best of the three. There's a case to be made. And the reason he does it is because he's a very good offensive player, kind of underrated offensive player, because he's not going to hit 40 homers, but he's going to hit for a high average. His career batting average is 304, and that lifts everything else up. So a career 357 on base, 492 slugging. And then what puts him over the top is that he's elite as a runner. So he makes a huge impact on the bases, and it helps his defense where he can play shortstop well, and he's historically been able to play in the outfield and second base. So he's versatile. I think he prefers to play shortstop, which is why some of these guys will look at Xander Bogaerts, Dansby Swanson, Carlos Correa. It may be that there's just not a fit here because they've got Crawford signed for next year. He's one of those few guys. Only Crawford and La Stella have guaranteed contracts on the position player side for next year. Doesn't mean a lot of guys won't be back, but those are the only two guaranteed to be paid a salary by the Giants in 2023. So I don't know. Trea Turner, like, could you convince him for this 1 year we're going to play you at second or in the outfield or at short if Crawford gets hurt, or at third or wherever? And then once Crawford leaves, you're going to take over this position. Perhaps. I have heard that his preference is to be closer, I think, to his Florida home or something like that, East Coast. So I have always kind of seriously doubted that the Giants will end up with Trea Turner, but he does kind of check a lot of boxes for the Giants. At the very least, can he please not go back to the Dodgers? Can we just please have him go somewhere else, if not to the Giants? But Trea Turner, extremely good player, put up 7 F4 Fangraphs wins above replacement last year, on pace to do about the same this year. So he is a star talent, and speed doesn't last forever. And so when that starts to decline, I do actually have some concerns about Trea Turner. If he starts to not be so fast, then he's not making that impact on the bases, and he's not as good of a defender. And then I have some more questions. So if you're giving him, a huge deal, I would have some pause about that. But he's a star, and any team should want this guy, including the Giants. Next player, Nolan Arenado. And this is a guy to circle for me because we always assumed, he said as much, I think, initially when he was traded to the Cardinals, that he was probably not going to opt out. He wanted to stay. And so ultimately, this is one of those guys, kind of like Freddie Freeman on the Braves last year, I just assume is going to stay where he is. Cardinals are good. They're peaking. Arenado's having a great year. I think he values the continuity. But if he can test the market, why not do it? If he can probably get more money, because that's the type of season he's having. Because he is a great defender, as we all know well. He had kind of declined a little bit, maybe, but this year he's been great again. Thankfully, we don't have to see it so much anymore. It's great having Arenado and Goldschmidt gone out of the division, but he's having a fantastic year. He's hitting 300 on the nose, 365 on base, 557 slugging. He's got 26 home runs. The great defense, a lot of contact. That's what's unique about Arenado, is the strikeout rate is just 12.6%. That's elite. And this is a guy who is a real power threat, who's not striking out, and he's a great third base defender. He is going to be, he's 31 years old. He turns 32 in April of next year. And so I actually don't have it pulled up, but I believe the contract he's currently signed to runs through 2027, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's a 5-year deal that he would be opting out of. And the value is kind of a little lower probably than what he's worth. But if you could sign Nolan Arenado for 5 years, I don't know. I mean, it's somewhat similar to like taking on Evan Longoria when the Giants did. You're paying for those ages, 32 to whatever, 36, 37 seasons. And we've seen how that can go. So maybe pump the brakes a little bit there. But at the same time, this is certainly a guy to look at. Longoria wasn't doing this at this point in his career. He was already showing signs of decline, whereas Arenado looks like his peak self right now. So he's a guy to pay attention to. Xander Bogaerts and Dansby Swanson and Carlos Correa, a trio of shortstops. So it's going to be another good shortstop class here. Trea Turner among them. Bogaerts is 29, Swanson is 28. Correa is going to turn 28 in September. So they're all in their 20s. And again, the Crawford situation, I'm not saying like don't sign a shortstop simply because you have Brandon Crawford signed. I don't think they should do that. They should get creative, and it's just one more year of Crawford. You do have some prospects like Marco Luciano coming, and maybe the consensus in the industry is that he's going to have to move off of shortstop, Luciano. So I wouldn't hesitate to sign it depends on how the Giants view him. If they really view him as the shortstop of the future, maybe you want to clear that path. But I wouldn't not sign Trea Turner just because I'm thinking about maybe Marco Luciano can stick at shortstop. So Bogarts is really good. He 4.4 Fangraphs wins above replacement, just to give kind of a general summary in one number. He's going to hit you for a high average. He's going to make a pretty good amount of contact. He's going to get on base at a high rate. Just a good player overall. And Swanson has kind of had a breakout from former number 1 overall pick, traded to the Braves, and now he's just excellent defensively, impact runner, and he's kind of come into his own offensively. I would imagine he stays with the Braves. There are reports that they're trying to work out an extension as we speak, but Swanson is a really good player, but a true shortstop where most of his value, you don't want to move him off shortstop because he's not elite offensively. So much of his value comes from being an elite defensive shortstop, so probably not the best fit per se. Carlos Correa is a guy who can opt out of his deal with the Twins and should be an interesting target for the San Francisco Giants, just like he was last year, and they didn't ultimately seem all that interested. I kind of just lean against believing that Correa would end up a Giant, but he's just definitely someone to watch and maybe stick him at third base while Crawford is still on your team, or if Crawford deals with injuries, or if he just doesn't perform well, you just make a change there. But there's a lot of shortstops out there, and that's kind of the main point. And all of them should be on the radar for a team that said they're going to need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 everyday players to be established. And it seems like the only route is through free agency or through a trade this offseason. So momentarily, what about first base? This is where Brandon Belt is on the last year of his deal, and seems increasingly likely that he actually will not be back, or at least not be just handed the everyday role. So who is out there at first base? We'll get into it momentarily. All right, as promised, what is the situation at first base in terms of the market? Who is out there? There's really not that much, but we've seen that the Giants have been willing and able to kind of mix and match. Like when Belt has gone down, it's been Lamont Wade Jr., it's been Jock Peterson, I don't think has played there, but I'm not even remembering because it's such a revolving door. Wilmer Flores and J.D. Davis has played there, I think, one time with the Giants. And so J.D. Davis, I mentioned there's only 2 guys with guaranteed contracts. J.D. Davis is a guy who's arbitration eligible, and he's almost certainly going to be back. And so I think he could be more of an everyday player. He doesn't really actually have strong platoon splits in his career. In fact, he has like no platoon splits. So I'm a little confused as to why they're platooning him right now. I would imagine they don't believe that would last if he gets more exposure. And sometimes it's not just about the handedness of the pitcher. It's about like what pitches do they throw and what pitches do you handle well. So like if you're really good at hitting fastballs, they put you in there, whether it's a lefty or a righty, if the guy has a good fastball, for example. So we don't always talk about that, but that's sometimes if you're like, why isn't this guy starting, or why is this guy starting? That can be why. So anyway, if they want to go a more everyday route, there are a couple of possibilities that I see. One of whom is Josh Bell, recently traded to the San Diego Padres, but has been a good offensive player. I just have some questions about the defense and athleticism. And the Giants, Farhan Zaidi, in this interview, this podcast with Tim Kawakami that we keep referring to, he did talk about the need to get younger and more athletic. And I'm not sure that Josh Bell necessarily fits into that category, but there are just not a lot of first basemen out there. And so I do wonder what is that first base situation going to look like next year? It is not very clear at all. It could be J.D. Davis, and it could be that, you say 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 everyday players, but that still means 7 or 6 or 5 or 4 platoons. So you're still going to have some platoons. And that's what Zaidi was saying, was that ideally, like, the platoons make up some of your lineup, but not all of it, and that you have those established everyday guys. And so maybe first base is a position where they platoon. Maybe, I mean, Lamont Wade Jr., it's going to be a big offseason for a lot of guys. Like, he's out of minor league options. He's arbitration eligible or pre-arbitration eligible, but he's not on a guaranteed deal. And so how much longer can they hold on to him when he's just not performing? Similar deal to Mike Yastrzemski, although he's been more of an established guy than Wade. But I don't know. Wade could be an option at first, or he could not. And so they could bring back Belt on a tiny little deal and just hope that he's healthy enough to platoon with JD Davis or something. So they'll figure something out. They've got to fill the position, but it's a pretty murky outlook in terms of what it's going to look like next season. The only other name that really jumped off the page for me in terms of free agents was Jose Abreu, currently of the Chicago White Sox. He spent his whole career with the White Sox, and he's having a very good offensive season. And Zaidi kind of walked himself back as he was saying they need to get younger. He said, he kind of corrected himself and said, we need guys who are going to stay on the field and produce. And it doesn't really matter what age they are if they're durable and producing. And I agree. And Jose Abreu is actually a really good example of that. He has been the pinnacle of durability. Like, I looked through his career, he's the only season he played less than 128 games was 2020, when it was a 60-game season and he played 60 games. So this man is very durable. 123 games played already this year. A 144 weighted runs created plus, meaning just very good offensively. Only 14 home runs, so he kind of is doing it with more, batting average, 310, batting average, 386 on base, and kind of doubles power, I would imagine. He has a lot of doubles given this line. Yeah, 29 doubles already this season. So he's a good player. I would imagine he wants to stay in Chicago, where he's been his whole career, but you never know. And if you could get him for like a 2-year deal, I think he could fit really nicely as a middle of the order right-handed bat, short-term deal, not a long commitment, and he can be an everyday guy and a good one. So anyway, that was kind of my run through there. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast Locked On MLB on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance, and thank you to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again on Monday. Have a great weekend. Giants versus Twins. They need to win. They need to win at least 2 out of 3 and preferably sweep them. So we'll be back on Monday breaking it all down. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.